Welcome to this week's edition of the SEO Club podcast. In this edition, we're going to be talking about a very special topic. And the topic of the day is news websites. In front of me, I have a very special guest, Barry Adams. Barry, would you like to introduce yourself to the SEO Club?
Yeah, sure. My name is Barry Adams, Dutchman in Northern Ireland. I've been doing SEO for 25 plus years, specializing in news SEO for the last 14 years. And I work with publishers of all sizes and scopes to help them get more traffic from Google, specifically the news elements in Google search, like the top stories carousels, the news tab, the Google News vertical, and of course the Discover feed.
Excellent. And if our followers would like to find you, where will they be able to find you most easily, Barry?
I've given up on social media except for LinkedIn, which is sort of a necessity in work. And all other social media is a toxic shit heap, so I'm staying off of it. But I have a newsletter, SEOforGoogleNews.com. I have a website, polemicdigital.com, about my consultancy business, or just add me on LinkedIn. Fairly easy to find.
Great. So, Barry Adams, as a news expert, what is the largest misconception you encounter when talking about SEO on news websites?
I think people underestimate how fast news moves and how it is necessary to optimize an article before you click publish. That's probably the one key lesson that many people, both in news and outside news, don't really understand. In most contexts, it's fine to publish a piece of content and then go back in and tweak it and optimize it and try to get more value out of it. In news, that generally doesn't work. It's because news articles are very rapidly crawled and indexed by Google because Google wants to show the latest news stories on any given topic. And Google doesn't necessarily recrawl and re-index those articles until several hours or several days later. So if you have published an article and then you go back in and make changes to it, chances are Google will already have indexed that initial version of the article, and any changes you make will just be too late to make an impact on how that article ranks and performs in Google search results. So it is absolutely key in news SEO to do your SEO on an article before you click the publish button, not after you click it.
So, if we take the takeaway over there is you only get one shot, make sure it counts.
Absolutely, absolutely. Every article has a very short shelf life in the news ecosystem on Google because it's news. It doesn't stick around in the search results for years, unless people specifically go and try to look for it. Um, so every article you get one opportunity for it, and if you don't get it right, it's just not going to perform.
Great. And I'm sure the audience is very heavily focused on SEO. And, when we're thinking about SEO, typically most people optimize for Google search almost exclusively, not even for other platforms, Google search exclusively. So, for a news site, what are you optimizing for?
For search and for discover. Search for news is not necessarily the 10 blue links, it is top stories carousels. Top stories boxes are fairly common on news results. They used to be a lot more common. It used to be that like 1 in 10 search results would have a news box of some description. I think now it's down to 2 or 3 or 4% sometimes, which is not as popular as it was, but it's still a significant chunk of Google searches. Google does 2+ trillion searches a year.
Mm.
So even a small percentage of that is hundreds of millions, billions of searches that have a news box. So for when we optimize for Google News, we actually are optimizing for top stories primarily. Uh, but we're also optimizing for the Discover feed, which is the other popular traffic source to news publishers. And that's a really interesting one because it's not search based. The Discover feed on Android phones or in the Google app on iPhones is just a recommendation engine for Google showing you articles that they think are relevant and interesting to you. And it's a slightly different way to optimize for Discover than you have to optimize for search, which sometimes means that publishers have to make a choice whether an article is Discover focused or search focused. And generally, if it's a real news article, as in a breaking news topic or something that's very newsworthy, you tend to optimize it for search because that's where people tend to go to find news articles. Whereas if it's more interest based, maybe a bit longer shelf life, a bit more engaged with people's hobbies, then it would definitely be a Discover focused article.
And for the audience that doesn't know what Google Discover is, so if this is your first time hearing about Google Discover. And believe me, there are a lot of people in SEO who this would be their first time hearing about Google Discover. What is it? Is it like a social media feed? How does it?
It's a
How do I
curated
access it?
feed. I mean,
Yeah.
you open the Google app on the Android, and Google will give you recommendations for articles. If you scroll past the search box, you get article recommendations. And every user on Android will have this, and most users who have the Google app on their iPhone will also have this. And those recommendations are based on what Google knows about you as a user, what you're interested in, which websites you read, what topics you like to click on, and of course related to the articles themselves. If Google thinks they're high quality, if they're relevant and they're interesting. And it's a curated feed. In that sense, it's very much based on engagement signals, that if you engage with topics and specific websites in your Discover feed quite often, you get shown more of those topics and more articles from those websites. Um, and it's very interest based. Again, like I said, it's what Google knows about you. Google has a pretty good picture of who you are as a user. If you have a Google account, they will harvest all this information about you. Initially intended to sell to advertisers, but it also helps them make a very interesting Discover feed for you, so it can show you content that you will probably find interesting. If I open my Google app on my iPhone, I get a lot of Marvel comic stuff, a lot of sci-fi stuff, a lot of stuff about rugby and cricket, because I'm just that sort of guy. I like reading articles about those topics, and therefore Google will show me more of those topics. So it's basically a social media feed without the social. There's no friends, there's no connections, there's no angry uncles shouting about politics. It's purely content that is curated specifically for you, that Google thinks you might find interesting. And that also means that every single person will have a different Discover feed with different articles and different content just for them. It's a highly personalized feed of articles specifically for you the moment you open it.
Yeah, and if you're this is the first time that you're hearing about Google Discover, just to put things into perspective, there are, I believe, over 800 million users on Google Discover as of a
I
couple of
think it's
months ago.
upwards of 1 billion now, actually, because pretty much every Android phone has it. And for many of my publishing clients, it is actually a bigger source of traffic than Google search. For many publishing clients, it is the single largest source of traffic to their websites. And that is also a bit worrying because it's such an unpredictable source of traffic. It's not something that you have a clear handle on, and it can just disappear overnight. I've seen that happen with some publishers, that for one day to the next their Discover traffic just evaporates, whereas their search traffic might just be chugging along as usual, which makes it a very interesting but unreliable source of traffic. And it's something I tell my clients: if at all possible, Discover traffic needs to be framed internally as bonus traffic, because it can just disappear. And you need to sort of see it as extra traffic outside of the usual acquisition sources like you have with Google search, with social media channels, with newsletters and all that sort of stuff. But because of the sheer scale that Discover traffic can present for some publishers, they don't really see it as bonus traffic, they see it as core traffic. And that makes me a bit uneasy because it's more difficult to optimize for, because it's highly curated by Google themselves. And it can just evaporate from one day to the next with no advance warning. And you might not be doing anything wrong as a publisher to just see all your Discover traffic disappear. And we don't really have any mechanisms to get more information about how websites perform well in Discover and how they don't perform in Discover, because the Google spokespeople, the Danny Sullivans and John Muellers of this world, don't really talk about Discover at all. So we have very little information to go on how it works and how websites can suddenly disappear when we appear in it.
Would you trust them if they did?
Well, and I've never trusted them in the first place, but sometimes what they don't say is just as insightful as what they do say. But because they don't talk about Discover at all, we really have so little information to go on.
The hallmark of a great SEO. So now that we've spoken a little bit about social media, interest-based, we've also spoken a little bit or mentioned a little bit about email lists and newsletters. If you had to rate, let's say, by importance, the traffic sources on a news website, one downwards, one being the most important, how would you rate it, and how much of an impact does that traffic source have on the actual news website?
It depends on how you phrase important. I mean, for me, the most valuable traffic a publisher can get is branded search traffic. Branded search, which we as SEOs can claim no responsibility for. That's just people wanting to read content from that brand. That for me is by far the most valuable source of traffic. That's traffic that wants to read your content, that wants to engage with your brand, and that you can very easily convert into subscribers for newsletters or paywalls or whatever it is. The second most important is generic search traffic, as in people not searching for your brand but searching for news topics and finding your website. And I say this partially because I'm an SEO, so I have a vested interest in it, but also because generally it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, source of traffic to most news publishers. And it's also traffic that's fairly convertible if you tend to show up regularly for search topics that users are interested in, and you might have a paywall or a subscription wall of some note. Then you tend to be able to convert a decently high percentage of those readers into actual subscribers. Example would be, for example, the Athletic, very focused, high-quality sports news websites, and they tend to show up in top stories boxes fairly regularly, despite the fact it's hard paywall content. But they get good subscriber numbers. People want to read their content because they have very good coverage, very good journalists working for them, and search traffic is one of their primary acquisition traffic. I hesitate to mention Discover because, like I said, as a third source, because it is sort of bonus traffic, so I'll probably leave that to the side. But I do think the more the traffic source comes from a loyal audience, the stronger it is in its potential, which is why I'm also a fan of having email newsletters, which can be semi-automated to a certain extent, where, for example, you have a section or a subsection within your website, like you have sport and you have Formula One, then just having a newsletter about Formula One stories that you can send out once a week to people who subscribe to that. So they don't have to actively go to your website, they can just receive those news stories in their inbox. And that stuff, like I said, can be mostly automated. That too is a very valuable acquisition source, and also fairly convertible. And the social media traffic, the Facebooks of this world, I hesitate to mention Twitter because it never was a big source of traffic for most publishers, just a tiny drop in the ocean. And now it's even diminished even more since it's become basically the de facto platform for Nazis. But yeah, Facebook used to be a fairly decent source of traffic, but that has also been shut off more or less as Facebook focuses more on content from your friends and family and not on content from corporate pages anymore. So it's become a trickle of traffic nowadays, and there's not really a social platform that is picking up the slack in that regard. So I think we need to see social traffic as sort of a lost cause and not necessarily worth optimizing for anymore.
Or rather, the source of misinformation, right? If you want to get fake
Yes.
news out there, maybe it's the platform for you.
Well, as a news publisher, if you're actively trying to get people who want to read fake news to your website, you're probably on the wrong track in the first place.
Which leads me to another question that I wanted to ask. So, typically, when I'm optimizing for, I don't know, a typical online product, like a technology product or so forth, I have a way of qualifying customers nowadays. So, I want to understand the quality of their product. Because, I mean, now I've been in this game for a very long time. So, I've been here for over 10 years. And, I've had a couple of experiences in the past where you do extremely great work, then you'd get a very lot of customer acquisition or rather traffic acquisition, but then it just wouldn't convert on the website. And ultimately, the user signals just lead you on a negative path. And then you end up having to build up the product again with the client and then, building back up to where you were. So, I mean, typically on Google SERP and the way that I operate, I have a pretty good way of and process of understanding the quality of the product, even if I've never worked in that particular niche beforehand. But looking at news website is a completely different beast. So I would imagine that, I mean, it's a news website. So what is the news product? If you're evaluating, I don't know, as an example, you're an agency owner, a freelancer, a consultant, or maybe you're even just operating a news vertical of your company. What are the key factors that would contribute to the product of a successful news website? And what are some of the key, let's say, red flags that you would need to look out for that could contribute to maybe not so much of a great product, which could lead to not so great SEO in the long term?
That's a very good question. I think the key is information gain. As in, if you're a news website that creates stories, that has original reporting, or even if it's not something you originally reported, you still have something new to say about the topic, maybe a different angle, a better background perspective, an opinion on whatever is happening. So if you're creating new information and adding to the conversation, I think that's really what sets you apart as a quality publisher. That's something you actively need to engage in. To have any chance of surviving in a very crowded online space with very narrow margins, primarily because the big tech companies have stolen all our advertising money. Um, and on the other hand of that, if you're a news publisher that doesn't create information gain, that doesn't add anything new, you're just reporting what others are also reporting, um, you tend to have a bad time nowadays. I see that as one of the key trends in recent Google algorithm updates, probably the last 4 or 5 years or so, that websites get punished if they're not adding new stuff to the conversation. And it's not necessarily that Google detects it directly, because we've always suspected, and in the last few years we've seen it confirmed again and again, that Google is terrible at understanding content. But Google understands links and clicks very well. That's sort of what they built their whole algorithm on. And if you are a publisher that adds value to a news topic with original reporting or original articles, you tend to be cited and quoted more often, which means you get more links pointing to you. Plus, you tend to have a stronger brand presence because people will know you as a creator of original reporting, which means you also tend to get more branded searches, you get more clicks when you show up in the Discover feed or in any sort of browser. And all those signals contribute to Google understanding that you are probably a quality outlet. Whereas if you're just another publisher in whatever niche you're focusing on, be that video games or politics or whatever, you're not really adding anything new to the conversation. You're quite a forgettable publisher. You tend to not acquire as many links from other sources. You tend to not get as many brand searches trying to find your website, and you tend to get a lot less clicks in general from whatever sources Google is measuring. And all those signals contribute to you being seen as a low quality publisher. So for me, the key is absolutely information gain, adding to the conversation, adding something new to whatever it is that you're covering, rather than being just another generic outlet on whatever it is you're reporting on.
So the takeaway over here is that you need to have unique, differentiated content and fill up those gaps, be unique. And then I would imagine that you need to organize yourself in a way to gain the maximum potential, right? So, I mean, there's the concept of tags and categories, right, on news websites. So, are there maybe some tips you can offer to our listeners about when they're organizing themselves in terms of the categories they're choosing, how they're tagging posts, and how this plays into the ability to, I don't know, gain more reputational authority with Google and get their message out there at a scale and at a larger than if they were to just, post it haphazardly without a process?
Yeah. Top navigation is incredibly important, because that's basically you laying out your stall and saying this is the topic that we cover. I see too many news websites that just have a top navigation that says news and opinion and video, and that's it. And people don't search for that shit. People don't search for news. No, they don't. They search for topics. They want to have the latest news on the US election. They want to have the latest news on the iPhone 16. So they search for topics, which means you have to have a top navigation aligned with topics, which is something you tend to see with the most successful news publishers. They have top navigation buttons, category pages that are topic focused, not type focused. You don't want to organize your content by the type of content on a news website. You want to organize it by the topic of the content. So you have to really put a bit of effort into deciding what your top navigation links are going to be and how you're going to label them. It's classic information retrieval. You need to understand that top navigation is basically you saying, right, these are the topics that we cover, and for a general news website that can be like politics, world news, business, sports, all of those things. And for a niche news website, if you're, for example, a smartphone website, you can have like Samsung and iPhone, Apple, or Google, and all those things in there, and Android and iOS and whatever subtopics you want to identify there, as well as maybe contextual sub-navigation. On the Samsung, you have different subtopics for their phones and their tablets, etc., etc. And you have to put, like I said, put a bit of thought into that, and then make sure you categorize your content accordingly. Because with your navigation, you're basically telling the world, both Google and your readers, that this is what we're all about. This is what we as a website are about. So you need to put a bit of effort into that. We need to put a bit of thinking into that. And then as a second level, I think tagging is very important. And you basically need to see a tag page as a category page that doesn't fit in your top navigation. I think that's probably the healthiest way to looking at tag pages. It's just another way to categorize content in an additional way, a more granular way than you can do in your top navigation. And at the same time, by using tags, you're telling Google that, oh, these are topics, subtopics that we cover regularly, that we have editorial expertise in, that we want to be known for. Which can be, as wide-ranging as, like I said, the U.S. elections, or very specific, as in like one particular event, like the Pennsylvania primaries or whatever it is. But you need to, again, put a bit of thought into that. And generally, news websites make one of two mistakes when it comes to tagging. Either they don't use tagging or they use it too much. Either one of those approaches is a mistake. It's one of those happy medium kind of tactics, where you want to use tags to, like I said, indicate authority on subtopics within bigger topics, because each one of those tag pages is basically you telling Google, like, we have original reporting on this topic, so please trust us when we report on this. And I always equate that to e-commerce. If you go to an e-commerce website, I think they have a subcategory of like smartwatches, and there's two products in that category. That basically tells you, right, these guys do not specialize in smartwatches, so I might not want to buy for them because they have very low offering on this. Whereas if you arrive on e-commerce websites and they have 1,500 different smartwatches in that category, you know what? Great offering. These guys must have a lot of expertise when it comes to smartwatches, so I'll probably buy from them. Tag pages are the same in the context of news. If you have a tag with two articles in it, that's basically you telling Google and the world, yeah, we suck at this. We barely cover this topic. Whereas if you have a tag page with hundreds of articles assigned to that tag, you're telling Google and the world, yes, we have expertise. We cover this all the time. We are a very good journalistic outlet on this particular topic. And that's how you need to think about tags. And that's also how you need to think about creating new tags. So don't just create them willy-nilly, but have a bit of a think. Like, is this a topic that we're going to be covering regularly, that we're going to be adding new articles to on a regular basis? Or is it just something that's just a one-off flash in the pan and then disappear? And sometimes it's okay to create a tag for just a short, focused topic that has a very short shelf life. Again, I'll use US election 2024 as an example. It is just a flash in the pan in the grand scheme of things, but at the same time there's probably a lot of volume of content that will be associated with that, so it's probably worth creating a tag for. And yes, the tag then will go dormant after the election has happened and hopefully passed without incident, but it still shows you that you have had historic expertise on the 2024 election, so when the 2026 House and Senate election comes around, you create new tags for those, and Google say, all right, that's a continuation of what you've done previously. Plus, you should always have an overarching category or tag that just says election or US elections. And you also file all those articles under that main category as well. So, when it comes to categories and tags, like I said, have a good think about it, manage your tags carefully. I'm probably a fan of having an internal role, can be an SEO editor or a journalist in a news organization, whose job it is to decide whether or not to create new tags and maybe once in a while clean up tags. And use them wisely. So make it part of the editorial production process that when an article is written and uploaded to the CMS, tagging is part of that process as well, with a bit of thought and consideration given to which tags are applied and why they should be applied.
That's really great feedback, very insightful, and I'm sure a lot of people would really take that to heart and answer a lot of questions which they probably had on their stomach. So, a typical trend that we see, let's say in online marketing in general, is so you cover all of the tags, all of the categories, you're getting all of the traffic that you possibly can from writing great content and so forth. And people tend to say, like, localize. So famously, Mr. Beast did this on his YouTube channel. And instead of creating, another 20 videos per year, instead, he just localized in 20 languages. I don't know if it was 20 languages, but I thought just stick to the same number, right? But when we're talking about, let's say, blogs and so forth, we've even done this ourselves in the past. So you have a technology website, you have a lot of content, you do your keyword research to see what the localized versions of that content is in other languages, you translate, and you start seeing, obviously you have to do a little bit more than just translate, but you manage to increase your traffic and cover new markets. Now, I understand that this might be a little bit challenging on a news website, especially when you're considering things like CCTLDs, subdomains, subdirectories. Maybe you can speak to our audience a little bit who's like thinking about, monetizing further. So they've really set up their operation correctly. They're really covering as much as they can. And now they're thinking about expanding into other territories and other languages. Are there any things to watch out for and any, let's say, advice that you could offer them in this point in time?
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic, and it's also one of those gray areas where we're not always entirely sure what the best approach is. As far as I understand it, the topic authority metric that Google has admitted that they use, which we sort of already knew it existed before they actually said that they use, but a lot of topic authority is associated about localization, local signals, which means that if you have a news event happening in a particular city, like in Paris, Google will trust news outlets based in or near Paris more than a news outlet that's based in an entirely different city or an entirely different country. Because Google understands they probably have journalists on the ground and are more directly connected to the news story than an outlet that's sitting 1,000 miles away. Um, but those local topic authority signals are based on the host name, as in the domain wide, basically host name wide. Um, and that's why it's very challenging to target multiple different regions with one website. As far as Google is concerned, you're either a nationwide website or you're a regional website, and there's no in between. You can't say, oh, we're just covering the west coast of America. No, that doesn't work. You're either like an LA-based newspaper or you're a US-wide newspaper. There's no middle ground there. And that makes it quite challenging. There was always some exceptions to that. You do see some websites performing on a regional level, but I think that's more by accident than by intention. And it's very hard to get into that particular mode and become a slightly broader outlet. As far as I'm concerned, you sort of have to do it all or nothing. So either you become a nationwide publisher or you become a hyperlocal publisher. And some publishers I work with have a slightly different challenge in that they cover like 3 or 4 different countries. Like there's the publisher based in the Balkans. They do Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia. But that's a pain in the ass because there's 3 different countries, 3 different languages, and 3 different cultures. And how are you going to establish expertise in all 3 of those countries? The answer is you're not. It's not going to work. You gotta have to pick one. And if you want to target all 3 countries, you will need 3 different websites or 3 different host names. A subdomain, 3 different subdomains can also work because a subdomain more or less behaves like an independent website. But that becomes more challenging and more complicated to set up and more complicated to manage. But yeah, it's a tough area. An interesting development I've seen in the last probably last 10 years, but especially accelerated in the last 3 years, is that a lot of UK-based publishers now wanting to target the US market, and they do that by either launching a separate .com website or migrating their entire website over to a .com domain away from a .co.uk. And generally, these moves work pretty well, and they're starting to get decent traction in the US market. Um, and for me, that's a very interesting development as well because it sort of puts American journalism on notice that you just can't take it for granted anymore. Just by being a big US news brand doesn't guarantee you get shown in top stories results anymore. And it also shows that these websites can have pan-national appeal. A website like The Guardian, for example, on a .com will show up in google.co.uk as well as in google.com for all kinds of relevant searches. So you sort of have to think, right, so there must be some sort of pan-national appeal there, but keep in mind that there is a very strong common denominator for those examples, which is that they all English language newspapers. So if you're on the same language, you probably have a bit more leeway and can target countries in multiple areas as long as they're all English language or using the one language. So if you have a Spanish speaking newspaper, you probably have a broader appeal as well, both in Europe and in South America. But the moment you go language specific, you really have to sort of fit into a very neat little box as far as Google is concerned, which is generally why I also tend to recommend having like CCTLD domains for a specific country. It's not necessarily that Google prefers that, it's that local users in that country tend to prefer CCTLD websites. It's very rare that you have like a French news reader who will read .com website. They tend to want to go to a .fr website. So there's lots of considerations in there, and it's a complicated topic, and there's no real one-size-fits-all approach. It's one of those areas where you sort of have to evaluate business needs versus SEO needs and see what the best possible approach might be for your particular scenario.
So I thought we'd go off track over here and talk about something which has been, let's say, causing a storm in the SEO world over the past couple of years: site reputation abuse. So it's quite a fun topic, this one. And I mean, just recently on the 6th of September, Search Engine Roundtable had an interview with Danny Sullivan. And when he was asked about SEO reputation, site reputation abuse, or parasite SEO, whatever you want to call it, his feedback was that there are going to be no algorithmic actions and doesn't expect there to be any in the near future. Now, the way I'm seeing this is that this split people up into two camps. Those that see this as a ticket to print money, and those who and those who got burnt and are more cautious now. But working with all of these different news publishers and seeing the real impact of what's been going on, Barry, what have you actually seen, and what is your message on site reputation abuse?
I have very strong opinions on this. By the way, that interview with Danny Sullivan, I was very frustrated when I read that, because it's obvious that Barry Schwartz was trying to get him to say certain things, and Danny was just swerving around that issue whatsoever. Google is not taking any responsibility for the damage that it's causing with their flawed algorithm updates, and it really angers me on a profound level. When it comes to site reputation abuse, again, I feel Google is overstepping the mark. Newspapers, before they went online, always had very long established commercial relationships with providers of voucher codes, with gambling companies, with other sorts of advertising mechanisms. And the coupons, the voucher codes, the sports betting, that just was a natural progression on the web from relationships that were established in the last 100 years. But Google suddenly decided that they didn't want that to happen anymore. They didn't want a news website to be able to rank for new coupon codes and voucher codes or sports betting content, and they wanted to just have first-party suppliers rank there. And I don't really understand their thinking behind that, because the end result is the same. Users get the same bloody discount codes and vouchers. There is no added value there for users. It's just Google suddenly deciding to kill off a revenue stream for news publishers. And that is the only outcome of this. There is no other benefit to them doing that. And I also find it a profound level of hypocrisy that Google says, yeah, we want to cut out the middleman. They are the largest fucking middleman in the world. But they just don't want anybody else to take that cake. What I have seen, though, what Danny said is very counter to what Google first said. Google first said there was going to be an algorithmic component to the site reputation abuse spam policies. And now they said, actually, no, this one not so much. Which I sort of understand, because when you look at it, this stuff is very hard to algorithmically solve and very easy to get false positives. So I understand that they're sticking to manual penalties. And when it comes to manual penalties, they have been handed out like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. My clientele alone, I know 32 websites that have had a manual penalty applied to a specific section of their website for site reputation abuse. And it's nearly always coupon codes, voucher codes, sports betting, and that sort of stuff. But they have very highly targeted penalties as well, where only that section of the website is penalized and suffers traffic losses and sometimes disappears entirely from Google's index. The rest of the website is unaffected. No change whatsoever. So for me, you do have a little bit of wiggle room here. You can just try and launch it and see what happens until Google catches on and then manually penalizes you, and then maybe you move to a new subfolder and try a new approach. Or you can just try to find a sort of a gray area where it's still curated, it's still based on original content, and then you make personal recommendations for specific discount codes or affiliate links and stuff like that. You tend to get away with that. But again, you're just trying to conform to an interpretation that Google has about how the web should work, and that for me is a fundamental issue that we have now with the web, that Google is so powerful that they decide which business models work and don't work on the web. They decide which companies get money and which ones don't. And that to me is absolute poison. That is the cancer we have on the web at the moment. And now I make my living off of optimizing for Google, but I really do want Google to be broken up. I really do think Google is too powerful, exerts too much influence, and just basically controls what happens on the web. And this is a situation we should not abide by in any way, shape, or form.
And we will put a link in this video to a podcast related to the recent antitrust law case, which Google will be appealing. So if you want to learn more about that, please give that a click and a watch. It explains exactly what Barry is talking about in extreme detail. So if you are going to release a parasite website, or let's say subdirectory, subdomain, whatnot, what would you say the correct approach would be right now, Barry? Or let's say maybe there are some, maybe don't give away the tricks, but would there be any advice, like one key pointer you'd give people who are thinking about doing this right now?
I mean, it depends on what you define as the correct approach. The correct approach, as far as Google is concerned, don't do it, and I don't think that is the correct approach at all. I think you need to just push those boundaries as far as you possibly can and squeeze every bit of money out of it as you can, because why not? Um, what I do see working to an extent is, like I said, original content, where you still have a person writing the content, make sure it's unique, and then inserting links to relevant offers in that content. You could do, for example, a top 10 recommendation list, and then make sure that each of those recommendations is like based on or showcasing to be based on personal experience, and then put a link in there to that particular third party that is supplying the discount code or the voucher code or whatever it is, the sign up bonus. Um, I think you get away with that, especially if it aligns with what you're known as a publisher anyway. If you're a sports website, you can make sports betting recommendations and put that as part of your regular reporting on whatever the next game is going to be. And the key is there to make sure that it is editorial written content unique to your website, which means you need to put a bit more effort into it, obviously, rather than just copy and paste the stuff that you're provided. But I think that content does actually work and does actually have added value for users, and therefore Google is very unlikely to penalize it. So that's where I would sort of sit. For first-party content based on experience, manually written, and not just copied and pasted from somewhere else. And you put the relevant links in there that you get paid for when someone uses those links. I think that's probably one of the better approaches at the moment.
Authors. What importance would you give authors on the scale of having a successful or an unsuccessful news website? And what kind of entities and attributes do you need to be thinking about to bolster and, let's say, cover your bases when it comes to authors?
Yeah. Again, I don't think Google is as good at understanding this as they say they are, or maybe as they're hinting they are. Google does recognize authorship on a certain level, but not at a sufficiently accurate level that they make it a cornerstone of how they rank and evaluate content. I think it is still worthwhile having dedicated author pages on your publication website and providing a real photo, a short bio, links to active social media profiles, and also links to other outlets that the author writes for, to your author pages on those websites. And that's, again, primarily because Google understands links very well. So it's less about the author itself, it's more about the author page as an entity in the link graph and where you link out to other pages, as well as the articles themselves. I don't think Google is really that good at understanding author specialties. Not yet, anyway. It's just something that they struggle with. So I wouldn't say you need to go all in on authorship. I say do the bare necessities. Person schema markup again sort of helps with that. You can use the same as attribute to list all the different external references for the author, like social profiles and other author pages. And again, that just basically takes the place of links, really, creating that node in Google's knowledge graph for that particular author. It becomes a higher level of optimization if the author is a known entity in the knowledge graph with like a Firebase entry, Wikipedia entry. That's when Google has a better understanding of who that person is. But let's be honest, most authors will never get anywhere near that level of notoriety. So it's something that you do the basics for, but I don't think you should expect massive improvements by implementing good author pages. It's just something you want to showcase as a quality signal, not necessarily as a direct ranking improvement for your website.
The relationship that I have with receiving messages on Google Search Console from Google is one of trauma and panic. Is it the same with news websites, or would you classify the communication through Search Console with Google as a different kind of relationship? Maybe it's something more common.
Um, I'll tell you how I deal with my Google Search Console notifications. That probably tells you all you need to know. I automatically archive them in my inbox, and I occasionally go looking for them. And this is because the sheer scale at which news websites tend to operate means that whenever you get a new notification about an indexing issue or whatever it is, it's 99 times out of 100 it's absolutely totally useless. Just an FYI. So my because I have access to so many different Search Console profiles as well, and a lot of these are very, very large websites. I get about 150 to 200 messages a day from Google Search Console. I'm not going to read those. What's the bloody point? Sometimes there's something interesting in there, but that tends to correlate with like a traffic change. And this again is one of those areas where news websites are a very different kettle of fish than an average publisher, because if a news publisher suffers a very bad traffic drop, they tend to know within a few hours. Any major newsroom I've ever been in has live dashboards of daily traffic numbers, minute by minute, with an overlay comparing to the previous day and the average for the week before. So when they having a really, really bad day traffic-wise, they will know. And people will definitely be asking questions. And looking at Search Console is one of the first things they tend to do. Now the problem you tend to have with Search Console is that the data is 48 hours old. It's not a real-time insight tool, which means if you have a bad day, and it might be related to a technical issue with the website in the context of Google, we tend not to know that until 2 days later, at least, unless Google Search Console is one of their many, many hiccups and we have a reporting delay of a week, in which case we might need to wait a week. So in that case, it's slightly less useful than you maybe think. But it's still a useful traffic source. It is still the starting point of all my site audits. But as far as the notifications are concerned, they're next to useless.
Are there any recurring technical issues that you encounter that add, let's say, that if you were to resolve on a news website would add a lot of value, Barry?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues that I tend to see regularly on news publishers that they do wrong, as in the pagination is implemented in the wrong way, usually by clients like JavaScript, like infinite scroll or load more buttons, which isn't pagination as far as Google is concerned, because Google doesn't scroll and Google doesn't click when it indexes pages. So for Google, there's only one page of content. And again, we're talking about topic authority here. If you have one page of content with 20 articles and Google cannot see beyond that, then as far as Google is concerned, you only have 20 articles on that topic, which is not enough really to showcase topic authority, which is why you need to have crawlable and indexable pagination with the old-fashioned way with like individual URLs in sequence. Another issue I see fairly regularly is tracking parameters on internal clicks, on internal links. Publishers love to know where people click, and they use tracking parameters on internal links for that, which is a huge no-no. You don't want to do that. It is absolutely terrible, because a publisher thinks that, we have a canonical tag in there, therefore Google will always use the canonical version, and that just isn't true. The canonical tag is not a directive, it's a hint. And an internal link is also a canonicalization hint, and a very strong canonicalization hint. And Google regularly indexes URLs with the tracking parameters and will show those URLs in search results. Which means when someone clicks on one of those search results, that gets registered as an internal click because of the tracking parameters, not as a Google click. Which means the data you get from those internal tracking parameters is next to useless anyway. It's wildly inaccurate. And there are other better ways to measure how people click on the website. You should just not use tracking parameters. Also, because if you do this at scale, and some of my publishers' clients used to do this at scale, you're creating enormous crawl waste for Google, because Google will crawl all of those URLs with all the tracking parameters. I had one client that had a different randomly generated parameter string as a tracking parameter for every time an article was linked, depending on where it was linked. Was it linked from the homepage, a section page, a subsection, or from another article? And even per article link, it would get a different parameter. So that there was one article with like 1,700 different links pointing to it, different URLs associated with it because of how often it was cited and quoted across the whole website. That's 1,700 URLs to crawl for Google for just one piece of content, basically. Bonkers. You don't want to do that. So yeah, pagination, tracking parameters. I mean, load speed is a constant struggle. Core Web Vitals. Fortunately, it's not a huge ranking factor. If you're between green and orange in Core Web Vitals, I'm usually okay with that. It's really something that you want to focus on if you're all red. And that is also means sometimes having hard conversations with your advertising technology providers, because they tend to be the worst offenders when it comes to adding load speed and just basically messing up your core web vitals. But like I said, it's a small ranking factor. I don't think it's necessarily something that will give you huge amounts of uplift. Except maybe in Discover, I think it has a disproportionate impact on Discover traffic, and that is not because it's a direct ranking signal, your load speed, but I think it's because it impacts on engagement. If you have a very slow loading website, people just will slightly less inclined to tap on your result in the Discover feed, because they know that the website is sluggish to use. I'm just going to read another article instead. And that negative engagement signal does filter through in Discover. So that's one of the contexts why I would want to optimize for very fast load speed and very fast usability. So that's probably my top three really of issues that I tend to see on publishers. Oh, and yeah, not understanding the importance of good old-fashioned editorial SEO, especially if you have journalists with a print background. When they craft their headlines, they don't necessarily understand that Google doesn't understand context very well, and you need to be a bit more direct and straightforward in your headlines and not use any word gags or puns or anything like that. And that's sometimes a lesson you need to repeat several times before that message sinks in.
So if you're still with us right now, we're coming up towards the end of this, and we'll have, let's say, some of the best last few topics to cover with Barry, which I know he's quite passionate about, so it'll be quite an interesting response for sure. But before we get into those, Barry, maybe we can just cover one last thing, which have to do with the tools. So, I mean, every single SEO in with focusing on Google SERP only would either have heard or utilizes a SEMrush, an Ahrefs, or some similar equivalent. They know about Search Console. They know about some other tools which might be quite helpful for them. Are there any, let's say, non-generic SEO tools that are quite important when to factor in when talking about news websites?
Yeah, those general SEO suites I wouldn't say are entirely useless in the context of news, but they're a lot less valuable. If you take a tool like SEMrush and you see what the average search volume is for a news topic word, you get probably a wildly inaccurate estimate because it's based on average over the last 12 months. Whereas news topics go like this, up and down again. So you need a lot more real-time data when it comes to like defining the popularity of topics, which is why Google Trends tend to be one of the better sources and free. But you don't get volume out of that; you get relative popularity. SimilarWeb does have a real-time keyword data or semi-real-time keyword data with a very small lag, and that tends to be a bit more accurate in defining roughly what a search volume is for like a trending topic. Like for example, tonight, when we're recording this, there will be a presidential debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And if you type something like that into Ahrefs or SEMrush, you get a very generic search volume response, which is probably wildly underestimating. Whereas SimilarWeb will give you relatively accurate data on how popular that is right now. Other tools, because most ranking tools, they have maybe once a day ranking if you're lucky, rank tracking, or once a week rank tracking. And again, for news, that's next to useless because we don't really care about average rank across a week. We care about where do we show up in top stories. And that stuff changes from minute to minute. So you need specialized rank trackers. The two ones that I'm familiar with are NewsDash, news with a Z, newsdash.com, and Trisolute News Dashboard. Both of those tend to crawl Google search results like every 15 to 20 minutes and give you an accurate impression of when your article shows up in top stories, who else shows up in top stories for that particular search, when your article drops out of top stories, which means you might need to write a new article or update your existing article, things like that. And also they automatically tap into trending topics in Google News. So that's something that a lot of newsrooms will have to a certain extent to make sure they stay on top of what Google is showing and what the news topics of the day are and who your main competitors are in that space. And then, like I said, the real-time tracking. A Google Analytics 4 is just not going to cut it. You need like real-time data analytics. The biggest players there are Parsley and Chartbeat, and there's an up-and-coming player called Marfeel, which I think is incredibly powerful and probably better than Parsley and Chartbeat with way more accurate tracking as well. Plus, really interesting Discover measuring as well. And you need those real-time dashboards to really show how your news website is doing day to day. I don't think people outside of news understand just how urgent news SEO actually is, how real-time it is. You publish an article and you will know within the first half hour whether or not it's going to fly or not. You will know. And that's why that real-time tracking and having that sort of analytics dashboards that gives you pretty much a live feed of what's happening on your website is an absolute crucial part of making sure you have the right habits and the right mindset when working in a newsroom.
Thank you for that very insightful context and information. So I'm pretty sure that 90% of the people actually listening into this point in time are searching those tools right now. And maybe there's some promo code that you have that we could utilize for those tools, maybe for the next one, right, Barry?
Just get in touch with me. I know people at all the major tool providers. I can get you in touch and hopefully get you a good offer.
Great. So now to something which I know you have quite a strong opinion on, Barry. And I mean, 2020, you're on the tail end of 2019 and it's going into 2020, everything was about crypto and the bull run and all of the crazy stuff which was going on there. Then the hype died and then the AI bull run started, let's say. And, something which has been around for a long time. Artificial intelligence, in my opinion, is not new. I mean, been tapping into its machine learning and different variants for a very long time. I would say maybe it just got democratized to an extent. During the release of LLMs. But I'd like to hear your opinion, and I'd like the audience to process how you think when it comes to the impact that this has had on news, if any, content, and process, and what your thoughts are on everything related to AI.
I think initially it's massively overhyped. I think some media commentators, when they saw like search SGE and then what became AI overviews, they really started to panic and they thought, oh, all our traffic is going to disappear. And that felt very familiar to me and probably to you as well, because we've been through that cycle before when Google had like feature snippets or any other big new feature that they implemented on search results. Always a big panic in whatever industry was perceived to be under attack by that. And I think that that hype tended to be massively overblown, and we see that now. AI overviews is rolled out nearly everywhere now, and traffic impact has been fairly minimal as far as I can tell. A few single-digit percentage points for websites that have been directly impacted at most. So in that regard, it's just another search feature, just another crowded element on Google's search results page that some users will engage with and some users will not. However, I don't necessarily think that that's the end of it. I do think that this is the start of an evolution, and I do think people will start to use their internet-connected devices in a different way now that AI is becoming embedded. It's very interesting to see, for example, with iOS 18, what Apple is going to be doing with their more intelligent features that are now baked into the hardware of their phones and allowing people to do things that we've been promised for a very long time but haven't really materialized, like having actual conversations with your phone and trying to be more productive by just talking to your devices. We're just starting to see the early glimmers of what that might mean. And yes, that could have really profound impact on how people consume content online and how people consume information, how people engage with the news. But the actual process of creating news is still the same. Journalism hasn't really fundamentally changed at all. If anything, these tools also help journalism to a large extent in that they allow journalists to be more effective and more productive. And on the other hand, these large language models, in order for them to improve and constantly become advanced, they need news articles. They need new content created by human journalists, fact-checked for accuracy, to feed into their system so that they can continue to improve and become smarter and more up-to-date. So it sort of changes the balance of power a little bit, where previously websites were sort of surplus to requirement. Like 5 years ago, Google had more than enough content to show whatever the hell it needed in search results. And that's probably still true purely for search results. But except for news, because news is constantly being generated with new stories, new articles, new developments. And LLMs make this even more urgent, where they constantly need new accurate content to improve. So now suddenly news publishers specifically have a lot more power. They have a lot more bargaining chips on their table to engage with the big tech companies, to get paid for what they produce, and to make sure that they get a fair share at the table, where previously they were just seen as an afterthought, with some crumbs brushed off Google's multi-trillion-dollar table to make sure that the news websites weren't being too angry towards the regulators. But Google is feeling the heat now a bit more. And I also think we have to acknowledge that large language models in their initial phase have been built on whole-scale breach of copyright. They just consumed all the content on the web to build their proprietary product without asking permission. And they're barely even asking forgiveness. They're now just plowing ahead without ever asking if what they were doing was fair, or if they should compensate the creators of that content in the first place. But that ship has probably sailed. And there might be some compensation later down the line, but it's one of those typical examples where Silicon Valley will just break something without any regard of the consequences for it. But yeah, I mean, AI overviews, to come back to the main point, not the seismic shift in how search works that some people may have predicted. I do think it's interesting as a feature. I do think some people will like it and want to use it. I think the real power of LLMs has yet to be revealed. I think we're still in the very early stages, and we see it now that the hype cycle sort of died down. People are becoming a bit more gloomy about it, myself included. I do think LLMs, the current technology, might be a dead end. I don't think it's going to be leading us to artificial general intelligence that some people have predicted. I think the more I read about it, the more I think it is a technological dead end, and it just doesn't warrant the hype that it may have had so far. But there might be a next thing. There might be a new technology later on that will open the gateways and push us beyond that human level artificial intelligence that many of us have been hoping for so long. So it's very early days. I haven't really formulated a coherent opinion on it yet. I'm sort of in a wait and see mode. But for the time being, not much has really changed.
So I find it very interesting that you mentioned that news articles are required because Google needs data, or rather LLMs need data, and without data you cannot proceed. Otherwise you'll end up an echo chamber of spun content, spinning content based on spun content, and if there's no input you cannot generate a unique output. So let's close this off, Barry. First of all, thank you very much for this amazing, informative podcast. It's been incredible. And I guess if you could maybe just leave us with one more nugget of wisdom over here. Where do you see the future of news going over the next 5 to 10 years? So we've spoken about the now and how it is now, but let's say in a hypothetical world, where do you see it going?
This may be bad news to some people, but I think subscription models are really the way forward. I think people need to get back to paying for news, as pre-internet they used to do all the time. I think we desperately need accurate, trustworthy journalism, and if we do need it as a society, we need to be willing to pay for that. We need to be willing to sign up to paywalls. We need to be willing to hand over our hard-earned cash for news websites that we think are worthwhile, and we should stop shying away from that. If you like a news website, if you read that news all the time, just pay them, just give them money, buy a subscription. Make it worth their while to continue serving you content. And more and more websites are moving in that direction. And I also think that probably means people are going to be relying less on search for news, which, I'm an SEO for news. It's probably going to hurt my business. But I think it's healthier for the news industry. And I care more about the news industry than I care about my own job. That's why I love doing what I do. I think news websites need to be valued for the value that they add to society as a whole. And our getting used to reading news for free has been quite detrimental. So yeah, I think paying for news needs to become the norm again, and that'll be the main shift in the next 5 years, when more and more websites will have some form of freemium or hard paywall to go up, and I'm all for that. I'm a big fan of that.
Barry, thank you so much for your time. Everyone who stayed on this long, please do subscribe. We are going to be providing more content with experts such as Barry Adams on other topics and other niches moving forwards. Barry, please let our audience know in the comment section also of this video where they can find you and how they can get in touch with you. Please do leave us comments so that we understand what your feedback is and we can answer those questions and base our next comments and maybe have a second session with Barry eventually to cover those comments. Barry, is there anything that you'd like to let our audience know where they can, maybe we can let them know where to find you again and how to get in touch?
Yeah, like I said, I'm only active on LinkedIn when it comes to social media. Just Google Barry Adams and you'll find me anywhere. Although there's also an American preacher and book writer called Barry Adams, which annoys me to no end because he has a Wikipedia knowledge graph and I don't. Anyway, that's just my ego being bruised there. Barry Adams SEO definitely will show my stuff. Like I said, SEO for GoogleNews.com is my newsletter and polemicdigital.com is my consultancy website. And that's really it.
Thank you very much, Barry. I wish you a great day and thanks again.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Cheers.